In May 1938, an old tombstone was found in a dump off Mount Corrung Road, Ironbark, near Bendigo, Victoria. Nobody knew how long it had been there, or who had removed it from the White Hills Cemetery. It had stood over the grave of Thomas McElligott since 1859, back in the gold rush days, when McElligott, a storekeeper, was brutally murdered. McElligott's White Flag store was situated on the side of Ironbark Gully, just above the junction with Long Gully. It was a building made of wood slabs divided into 3 rooms. The first room was about 22 by 15 feet and was the shop section. Entrance was through folding doors, with a counter running along one side. A 7-foot partition walled off a bedroom area behind this, which was 8 by 15 feet. Behind that was a living area, also about 8 by 15 feet, with a side door opening to the yard. Near this door was a tent occupied by McElligott's mother-in-law, Mrs. Scanlon. 60 yards to the north were the tents belonging to some Chinese puddlers, miners who sought gold by washing it from lumps of clay. 300 yards to the northeast, past a puddling mill and a dam, was the tent where a miner named Chow Ah-Kee lived. Other tents were clustered around to the south, mostly housing Chinese miners. The only European miners within half a mile were a man named Inglis and his mate. About a quarter of all miners prospecting in Bendigo in the mid-1850s were Chinese, about 4,000 men out of a total male population of 17,000. Thomas McElligott was 26 years old, a native of Listowel in County Kerry, Ireland. He and his wife Anne had been married for 3 years. At 8:30 p.m. on the 1st of June 1859, Anne had been in one of the back rooms when she heard a noise in the store which alarmed her. She heard the door slam and some commotion start immediately. On entering the shop area, she saw her husband against the wall behind the closed outer door. 3 Chinese men were hacking at him with blades. She could see the metal glisten by candlelight as they attacked. Her husband was unarmed, and she went to help him, whereupon 2 of the attackers turned on her. A blow across the head felled her. While she lay on the floor, she was hit across the head twice more, stabbed in the arm, and cut on her hand. She got to her feet and ran for the back door, screaming for help. At the back door, she ran into her mother, Jane Scanlon, who was in the back room. She screamed that Tom was dead. Her cries having attracted attention, a man named Michael Long came and asked what was the matter. She repeated that her Tom was dead. Tom McElligott was not dead, however. He was standing just inside the door when his wife returned, bleeding from his head and right arm. Jane Scanlon asked again what had happened, and Tom said, "I'm dead. Go call for Paddy Neal." Jane found one of the weapons on the floor. It was a Chinese pikehead, 2.5 feet long, fitted to a wooden pole. It had been filed sharp on one side. The couple were helped inside and their wounds dressed while the arrival of a doctor was waited on. Dr. Dow arrived after an hour and found McElligott had been bleeding the whole time. Tom insisted the doctor check his wife first. Several flakes of bone were taken from her head. Tom had several lacerations on his head too. His hands were very cut about. One incision ran between the ring and the little finger all the way down to his wrist. All the tendons of the forearm were cut across. The elbow joint was completely exposed on his right arm, and there were minor cuts on the man's throat and back. The doctor was in constant attendance to McElligott. On Saturday it was decided that his right arm needed to be amputated, which it was. Initially he seemed all right, but at 7 p.m. on Sunday evening he began to grow delirious and raved. He seemed to recover slightly at midnight, but at 4 a.m. on Monday the 6th of June, Thomas McElligott died as a consequence of the blood loss. Although he had recognised Chow Ah-Kee, one of his neighbours, as one of the men, no deposition was taken before he died. It was rumoured that retaliation was being planned against Chinese miners for the murder, but when police checked there was no sign of any vigilantism. Nevertheless, the Chinese themselves knew that there had been friction with the Europeans. A prosperous Chinese merchant visiting from Melbourne counselled the chief men to assist with finding the killers. The government was offering a reward of £200, and the Chinese a further reward of £100. At the inquest a week later, Anne said she could not identify any of the attackers. She had not had time to look at their features, their height, their clothing, or if they wore hats. nor could she say for certain what weapons they used. It was revealed that Tom often loaned money to the Chinese miners, but there had never been any trouble with repayments, although some still owed him money at the time of his death. 18 months before the murder, there had been trouble over a claim in which a group of Europeans, including Tom, and a group of Chinese had gotten into a fight, but those miners had since left the gully. The pike head, stained with blood, was displayed at the inquest, along with a 20-inch long butcher's knife found on Friday, 50 yards from the store, also bloodied. The knife was found to have been purchased on the day of the attack for 5 shillings in Bendigo by 2 Chinese men. George Todd, who sold the knife, believed he could identify the 2 men. Detective Simon O'Neill, one of the police called the night of the crime, had found another butcher's knife, saturated in blood, hidden under a stretcher in an unoccupied tent 300 yards from the store, owned by Chow Aki. Also found in the tent was a wooden pole 4.5 feet long, a 3-sided file, and a hat with the name Aki in English written inside it. The tent was watched by police, but nobody had come near it since. Tom's cabbage tree hat, which he was wearing at the time, was also part of the evidence, with a cut from the rim of the crown through to the brim. Chow Aki had gone to Job's Gully, a mile from Ironbark Gully, and one night entered the tent of a man named Killoy, and saying his name was Chow Aki, asked him for some rice, as he was hungry. Killoy invited him to stay the night. While he was there, he was watched all night by 2 Chinese men. The next morning, the 8th of June, he told a storekeeper named Ah Kwan about the visitor. Ah Kwan spoke to him, and he repeated his name was Chow Aki, and that he had come from Ironbark Gully. Ah Kwan informed the police at Eaglehawk. Constable Dunlap came and took Aki into official custody. Near Ironbark Gully, a group of several European miners asked if the prisoner was one of the killers. Fearful of his prisoner being a victim of mob justice, the policeman replied, "No, his crime is larceny." He was placed with 7 other Chinese men in a line-up. George Todd, the storekeeper of Bendigo, picked him out as the man who had purchased the knife. On the 10th of June, Chow Aki, aged about 22, was questioned. He spoke English fluently, and said that he, Chin Ah Su and Chin Ah Hung went to the store on the pretence of buying some candles. He did not divulge a motive for their assault. When McElligott went to get the candles, the 3 men struck. Ah Su and Ah Hung were the 2 who attacked Anne. When she ran away, Aki grabbed the other 2 by their jumpers and urged them to run. Aki was taken back to his tent, where he identified several articles of clothing as his, and a jumper he said belonged to Ah Sol. When news of the arrest was made, fireworks were let off in celebration in the gully. 6 other Chinese men were arrested at about the same time as accomplices, as they were all believed to have had dealings of some sort with Chow Aki since the murder, but they were released for lack of evidence. At Chow Aki's trial, Anne repeated that she could not identify the men she saw that night. She knew Aki as a dealer in poultry who had lived 200 yards from the store. She did not know of any business dealings between Aki and her husband. George Todd identified Aki as the man who had bought the butcher knife from his store. Aki's defence was that the murder had been committed by Ah Su and Ah Hung without his prior knowledge. He had purchased the knife on Ah Hung's behalf because he couldn't speak English, and he wanted to start a butcher shop in Castlemaine. They'd induced him to go to McElligott's store, and there they had wielded the weapons, one man using the pike and the other the 2 knives. Aki did not have a weapon. After the attack he had wanted to remain, but the other 2 had forced him to leave, saying they would give evidence against him and have him hanged if he refused. His lawyer further argued that it was not the attack, but medical neglect regarding the amputation of the arm which caused the death. Dr. Barnett, who had checked on McElligott, said he had never seen so much blood flow from a stump, but he was not dying from blood loss at that time. Joseph Wilson G., a jailer at Melbourne Jail, was spoken to by Aki on the 17th of July. He said in a lively manner, "Mr. G, me hang morrow," while putting a hand round his throat in imitation of a hanging, and laughing. Between 4:15 and 5:20 p.m. that same afternoon, Aki tore some strips from his blanket in cell number 34 and cheated the hangman by strangling himself. On the 4th of July, 2 men, Ah Chong and An Ying, who had come down from the diggings to Melbourne, stayed one night at an eating house in Bourke Street, then hired a boat to take them to join the steamer Wonga Wonga after it had left the pier. They were waiting in scrub at Williamstown when police arrested them on suspicion of involvement in the murder. Interviewed separately through an interpreter named John Liu, the men gave differing accounts. One said they had been fishing at Williamstown for 12 months before they tried the diggings. The other said they met at Long Gully a few months before. On the 13th of July they were discharged as no evidence linked them to the Ironbark murder. J. McCulloch Henley, an Anglo-Chinese linguist who had spoken with Chua Ki and another man who knew the other two killers, said in a letter of the 16th of July 1859 that Chin Ah Su and Chin Ah Hung were both members of a triad and would have had help evading justice and fleeing Australia. Mr. Henley may well have been correct, for it appears that the other two assassins were never captured, and until the discovery of his tombstone the story of Thomas McElligott was just a half-remembered tale from the wild days of the gold rush. The mystery of the removal of the tombstone, at least, was solved. There had been 3 other burials in the plot, and relatives of McElligott decided sometime between 1913 and 1937 to replace the original stone with a more modern one. The old tombstone was taken to a monumental mason's yard, where it remained until the end of 1937, when it was removed during a clean-up of the yard.